Welcome to This Week in South Carolina. I'm Gavin Jackson. The 2024 South Carolina presidential primary is 9 months away, and it's already in full swing, with two South Carolinians, among others, eyeing the White House. Former Governor Nikki Haley has already announced her run, and Senator Tim Scott has launched an exploratory committee. Winthrop political science professor and director of the Winthrop Poll, Scott Huffmon, joins us to break down the latest results, including where Haley, Scott, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, and former President Donald Trump stand with voters. Scott, welcome back.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So, Scott, you brought us a new poll, and there's a lot we're going to digest here, but I want to start off with who South Carolina Republican primary voters are excited about some 9 months before our primary. Tell us what that polling's looking like, who's leading, and who's chomping at the bit there.
Absolutely. Well, Donald Trump is doubling up the next person. So Donald Trump is still the first choice of Republicans, self-identified Republicans who are registered to vote, got 41% support. Now, mind you, that is lower than some of the support that he's gotten nationally. But the fact is he's still doubling up his next rival, which is Ron DeSantis at 20%. But it's very important to note that Nikki Haley had 18%. That's within the margin of error. So Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis in this poll were in a dead heat at second place. And so, she has not formally been in all that long. DeSantis is not formally in. Donald Trump is incredibly well known. The question is, how much are they going to eat into his support? Now, nationally, Haley'd only been getting, 4%. So she's more than quadrupling her support. That's important in South Carolina because we are the first in the South primary for the Republicans. Iowa Republicans in the caucus don't look like the Republican Party. New Hampshire Republicans don't look like the Republican Party. South Carolina Republicans, we have every flavor of Republican out there. We look like the kind of Republicans you need to win over. And if you can win in South Carolina, then you can win in the South. And if a Republican sweeps the South, the 11-state South, they need less than 30% of all other electoral college votes in the general election. So we are the first test of that. Nikki Haley has had growing support, but she's still behind Donald Trump by at least half.
Yeah, it's interesting that you point all that out there, Scott, too, because we're that big state right before Super Tuesday, when there are a lot of southern states that springboard into Super Tuesday, of course. But when you're talking about, before we talk about more of this, talk about national polls versus polling like yours. I mean, a lot of times people look at those national polls, but it's not really reflective of what we're going to see in those early voting states. So when we look at polls like yours, I'm guessing there's a little bit more attention. They sit up a little bit more when they look at these numbers because it is state specific.
Right, and we don't elect people to be the nominee for the party in any type of national primary, much less a national caucus. God help us if that were to happen. But, the people in the Iowa caucuses matter far more than a national poll. The people who are going to show up in the New Hampshire primary matter far more than a national poll, because by the time you get to South Carolina and our test, and it could be an important firewall for Nikki Haley and Tim Scott, of course, then you are at a point where people are seeing whether you have momentum or not, whether you can get the funds, whether the backers are going to get behind you. And what happens in these early states means the national polling is going to change completely. So early state polling is actually a lot more important than national polling at this point.
And it is still very early as well, too. But I want to point to another poll that came out this week from National Public Affairs, which really mirrored your poll pretty closely there, with Trump at 43%, DeSantis at 21%, Haley at 19%. So, again, very close to what we're seeing, that jockeying for second place. And then Senator Tim Scott, who has not announced, and again, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has not announced either, but they're obviously eyeing it. Tim Scott's just launched his presidential exploratory committee, too. But when you're seeing this consistency, I mean, that's pretty firm to what the field's looking like at this point. So what are we going to have to do for some of these guys to really break through, like Nikki Haley?
Well, let's always remember that in 2015, Jeb Bush was going to be the nominee, and he was going to sweep his way to the presidency at this point in the stage. So we have to keep an eye on what's happening, keep a close monitor on these early state polls. Things could change. The big Republican donors not that long ago had a get together, and they were not as much behind Trump as you would think they would be behind a former president. And also, DeSantis wasn't winning over as many of them as possible. So when it comes to funding and getting your name out there in these early states, a whole lot could change because we've got a long road ahead of us.
Mm-hmm. And how do you how do you evaluate right now Nikki Haley's campaign? She launched it in mid-February. She's released some of her fundraising, which has been interesting to look at with some of the double counting going on there too. But what does she have to do to, increase her numbers here and also just really register with those Iowa and New Hampshire voters, in your opinion?
Well, she's got to pick up a little bit of the vacuum that Trump is leaving. DeSantis was trying to fill that vacuum as the Trump culture warrior without all the baggage. But DeSantis has been losing a little bit of ground lately, stepping over a few too many lines, doing things that some of the Republican faithful think you're not focusing on the right issues. Now, the interesting thing about nationally, there's a narrative that Nikki Haley is a moderate. And I really think a lot of that comes from the Confederate flag coming down off of the State House under her tenure and her supporting that. But if you look at her term as governor, she was absolutely not a moderate. She was the queen of the Tea Party in South Carolina, endorsed by Sarah Palin. That's how she got into the governor's mansion. She kept conservative during that. She is extremely conservative, but with less baggage than Trump has. And she is leaning more into the culture war issues than, for example, Tim Scott is. So she might be ready to take up some of the oxygen that's escaping from the room as people look at Trump and think this might not be the best choice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes me wonder about, when we see DeSantis, and there's a lot of stuff going on right now too, when it comes to back and forth between him and Trump. Is it going to be a matter of her or maybe Senator Tim Scott just kind of waiting around to be the nice guy in this situation?
Well, I don't think Haley wants to come across as necessarily the nice guy on certain issues. She has prided herself on being tough. When reporter and anchor called her past her prime, her first response was, "Hold my beer." She prides herself on being tough. She's not going to come across as the soft moderate. She may work coming across as somebody who's more reasonable. And this is Tim Scott's space as well. Tim Scott, again, the narrative is, oh, he's more moderate. If you look at his voting record in the Senate, he is not. His voting record is extremely conservative. So he's got the bona fides of being a strong conservative supporter, but he doesn't come across as unhinged like some candidates may. He comes across as much more moderated in his speech and thought. And so he's going to be able to take up some of that space of the reasonable alternative. The question is, how much traction can he get? And if he can repeat what he's done here in South Carolina, where he was constantly underestimated and constantly overperformed, then he can get some traction and make some moves as we go along through this election season.
Yeah, Scott, that was kind of my question here in terms of how he can do that, because your poll has him at 7% in a very distant, fourth place there. So, he's always polled very favorably in your polls as well as others nationwide. So it's interesting to see where he is right now because, we're talking about getting name recognition out there too in those early voting states. And that's something that Nikki Haley has a little bit more of because of her positions and, obviously her previous situations as governor and ambassador at the United Nations too. So, and then also with that comes a slate of accomplishments that she can point to, whether it's economic development, crisis management, or international relations versus someone like Senator Tim Scott. While their narratives might be the same, it's kind of interesting to see how they're going to have to differentiate between each other when push comes to shove.
Right. And it's a lot easier for a senator to say, I have international experience than a former governor. However, this particular former governor was also the ambassador to the United Nations. So, essentially appointing her to that post, which was a gift to Henry McMaster from Trump, pointing her to that post gave her experience in the one area where she would be seen as lacking if she ran for president. So now she gets to check a whole lot of the boxes for, I have the toolbox ready to be able to go in and step in on day one and be president. And that gives her an advantage a bit over Tim Scott, although, again, a senator would normally have an advantage over a governor when it comes to international relations. And you pointed something out. Tim Scott is always amazingly popular in our poll. Among anybody who has an opinion, he is popular. So a lot of folks don't have an opinion, but if they have an opinion on Tim Scott, it's usually positive. And as more folks get to know him nationally, they're going to move from having no opinion to, if they have an opinion, it's likely to be good, because that's been the trend here in South Carolina.
Mm-hmm. And he has money too. I mean, $21 million right now. He hasn't even launched a campaign, but we do expect to see one at least by June from him. Like we said, he has announced his presidential exploratory committee. So again, it's going to be a matter of spending that money. I mean, he could go up on advertising in the state of Iowa from now until the caucuses, and if he wanted to. And we're already seeing advertising play out in South Carolina. So is it really just going to be a matter of spending that money wisely and targeted in a way that he can get people to start registering with who he is?
Yeah, I think you're right. He needs to spend the money in a way that can build momentum. And one of the things that momentum will do will have an impact on the behind the scenes, the under the surface battle that's going to go on between him and Haley trying to get endorsements in South Carolina. I don't expect them to go after each other's throat publicly, but the fact is they will both be battling under a seemingly smooth surface to try and get endorsements from groups within the state. And then, of course, they also have to battle against the Trump supporters who, over the past few years, the MAGA groups, many of them have taken over control of a lot of county district parties. And so they're going to have to face that as well. So he has to spend money in order to build momentum. Building the momentum could help him in getting the endorsements in the first in the South primary, and all of those would be key to him advancing.
And that's going to be big for her, too, because while we're talking about money, I want to just focus on how much Nikki Haley raised in her first 6 weeks. And I'm going to use the term raised kind of loosely here because they did. They used a little Richard Extra math here when they announced, her campaign announced early that they raised $11 million in the first quarter, when in fact the committee, with committee transfers, she brought in about $8.3 million in the first quarter, which $5.1 million of which was from actual campaign fundraising. So I think she had a little bit more. She still had some pretty good money on hand, too, but really kind of going through it. And of course, it's still very early. So really going to have to ramp up that fundraising to not only keep up with the attacks, but also to keep traveling to those early voting states. Still early on here, Scott. And of course, there's a lot of people still out there. But what do you make of those fundraising numbers?
That was also an unforced error. Somebody wasn't paying close attention, and they thought that they had big numbers to put out. Paying a little closer attention would have meant, hey, we had a decent fundraising year. Instead, you tried to push the story at a phenomenal fundraising, and the story became, we don't know how to do our accounting. So again, that was an unforced error, and that's going to need to be controlled as the primary season moves forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think Trump raised about $14.5 million in the first quarter, too. So just kind of showing there how much is going on, and it's still very early and a lot of ground to cover going forward. But we just did see Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who is, weighing his run. Obviously, they're still in the legislative session down there in Florida. He's expected to announce after that wraps up there. But he had two big showings this week in North Charleston and Spartanburg. I was in Spartanburg and saw the crowds out there. Had about 1,000 people out there. Pretty warm reception. Crowds were pretty interested too. So it seems like he's already making some pretty good inroads in the state, where again, the road to the White House runs right through South Carolina.
Yeah, and he's going to have a base. The question is, are these people, super pro DeSantis to the point where they're anti-Trump, or are they, somebody who likes and wants to see DeSantis? Are his crowds at this point absolutely faithful or strong Republicans who are interested in seeing? But the fact that he's gotten a good turnout is a positive sign for him, because, as you said, road to the White House runs through South Carolina. He's going to have to come here and make a strong showing. Again, if he cannot perform well in South Carolina, then people are going to question whether or not he can sweep the entire South. And that's important for a Democrat or a Republican running for the president, because if a Democrat can crack the South in the general election, they tend to get the White House.
Yeah, and Scott, we look at some of the announcements this week surrounding DeSantis, too, with a lot of members of the congressional delegation in Florida supporting former President Donald Trump. Not too dissimilar from what we saw with Trump getting support from our delegation as well. We did see, Ralph Norman backing Nikki Haley. There's still Nancy Mace's endorsement out there too. I think Jeff Duncan as well. So it's interesting to see, some similarities there, trying to pick off and weaken DeSantis so early, as well as attack ads already up in South Carolina. It seems pretty early for that, but is that a sign that Trump is maybe just trying to get ahead of this?
Well, we long ago entered the phase of the constant campaign. The idea that the 2024 election might actually begin in 2024, that's been done since the 1990s, when we really did enter the era of the constant campaign. As soon as the 2020 election was over, the battle for 2024 began. So seeing ads this early is certainly frustrating for those of us who watch TV. But it's not kind of out of the realm of possibility. You want to weaken your opponent because you need a fundraising advantage at this point. You've got to get your name out. And one of the best ways to do that is to undermine the fundraising ability of your opponents. So I'm not surprised. It's just one of those things that in our current political system became inevitable.
Mm-hmm. Well, Scott, we can leave 2024 there and jump right back to your poll, which you had come out. And, you poll on a variety of topics very consistently, just so you can kind of get a very consistent idea about how South Carolinians are feeling about things. And one of the big issues that you consistently poll on is medical marijuana. That's an issue that's been under debate in the State House for some time now, several years, with Beaufort Republican Senator Tom Davis leading that fight. This year, the bill is pretty much dead. We have a couple weeks left in session. Even though it did get out of the Senate last year, it died in the House. So there's still a lot of back and forth there when it comes to passing such a really conservative bill up at the State House, even with support from the governor, which would be expected. But I'm just wondering what you think about things just not really tracking when it comes to public opinion versus what happens in the State House. I know that's kind of obvious. Sometimes that's not always hand in hand, but how do you mesh that? How come people don't really see that something's popular? Why not move forward with it? Even Republicans, even Democrats support this.
You got to go back to the issue of gerrymandering, right? So we're drawing district lines for the State House and the State Senate, and the State House and State Senate get to draw their own district lines. And shockingly, what tends to happen is districts are drawn extremely safe for the party that tends to control that district, to the point where a lot of seats, sometimes as much as 70% or more of the seats, go unchallenged in the general election. So that means the only election that matters is the primary. And if you're going to win the primary, if you're a Republican, you've got to run as far to right as possible. You're not going to have an opponent in the general election. So if you win that primary, you've won the general. If you're a Democrat, you've got to run further to the left than normal. If you're not going to have an opponent in the general election, you've won that election. So what you have is a more polarized state legislature that doesn't actually reflect how normal South Carolinians feel. South Carolinians, it's not that they're clamoring for marijuana, they're just not opposed to medical marijuana. A lot of people have heard about or even know cancer patients or folks that might benefit from this type of thing, and they're simply not opposed to it. However, that's not reflected in our much more polarized state legislature. However, the idea about recreational marijuana, there is a split there between Democrats and Republicans. That is not nearly as strongly supported as medical marijuana.
Yeah, it really does fall off there. I think it's 76% or so for medicinal marijuana, but then drops down to 56% favorability for recreational. And again, where no one's talking about recreational marijuana, at least in the State House, the focus is just on medicinal, and it's a pretty tight bill too. I mean, you don't even smoke cannabis under this bill. It's just, oils Edibles. And such. Yeah, yes. So very tightly written there too. So a lot to be following on that issue. But also sports betting is kind of something that's we've been seeing getting a lot of attention to. Other states have been passing bills for online legalizing of gambling on sports. You have a very, very slim majority there. 50% of folks saying we favor online betting. There's a bill that moved through the House. Narrowly moved through the House over to the Senate now. The governor's not a fan of this. So even if it made it out of the Senate, likelihood of getting the governor to sign it won't go forward. But what does that say to you when we look at the state and folks' reaction to this, especially when we talk about video poker in the late 90s and the early 2000s, the lottery always being so controversial? Sports betting doesn't seem like it has much of a chance.
Right now, with a scant majority being okay with it, it doesn't seem like it has a groundswell of support. We've asked in the past too about possibility of casinos in areas around Myrtle Beach and such. And again, there's not overwhelming opposition, but there's not a groundswell of support. And so if this gets out of the legislature and gets before the governor vetoes it, it may be a bit tougher to override that veto. It may not even get there. Again, looking at the fact that while it is right at half supported, and given the folks that have no opinion, that means less than half are opposed to it. That's a tougher sell.
Mm-hmm. And we're talking about some other issues in your poll. We just saw the Tennessee legislature and the governor ban public drag shows in the state of Tennessee. That's still having a hard time getting implemented in the state. There's also some concerns about a chilling effect on First Amendment rights there. But how popular of an idea is that in South Carolina, according to your poll? I mean, is that something people are clamoring for? I mean, I think there's a bill in our state house that hasn't gone anywhere. There's bills in several other state houses too. It doesn't seem like something that people are chomping at the bit to impose here in South Carolina.
No, that is something that is being publicly driven as one of these culture war issues, that America is going to crumble if we don't stop this thing. It is not something that is in the forefront of the mind of the average South Carolinian. South Carolinians are saying, "Oh my gosh, thank goodness the price of eggs is coming down." They're worried about more day-to-day things. Even the idea of medical marijuana, they're saying, I don't really care that much. I'm okay with it. When it comes to drag shows, they're just not in support of a ban because it's just not registering with them that much. And, there's always the amusing thing I like to point out with people. If you Google womanless beauty pageant and church fundraiser, you will be amazed at how many churches actually have what is in effect a drag show that they use as a fundraiser. So this is really specifically targeted not at men dressing as women or women dressing as men. It's really targeted at the LGBTQ community.
Yeah, and again, asking about public drag shows there too as a form of entertainment, and of course, you don't have to go if you don't want to. No one's forcing anyone to do that. But it's also interesting to see that you asked again about Christian nationalism, kind of going into that theme there too. You had several questions about that. Those feelings seem to have remained the same in terms of whether people think that, God has chosen the American people to be, his chosen people in a sense. I'm wondering, what do you think about that in terms of what that's registering like, maybe on the national level too, in terms of how we might hear some of that rhetoric play out on the campaign trail?
Well, and again, it is the number of people who are hardcore Christian nationalists, and these are people who think America was truly founded to be a Christian nation, should absolutely publicly declare itself to be a Christian nation, and also say you can't truly be American unless you're Christian. Those folks are a minority, but they are a minority that is passionate and they turn out. So as we go through the Republican primary season, I think we may hear some Christian nationalist rhetoric. Again, it may be at the dog whistle level, but it's going to be aimed at turning out people who are extremely passionate. The rhetoric will die down during the general election because that simply doesn't represent a majority of Americans. A majority of South Carolinians still say, yes, there should be a separation between church and state. But the minority who want to tear down the wall of separation between church and state tend to be very passionate and tend to be the kind of people who turn out in primaries. So we are definitely going to see some of that rhetoric, some of it overt, some of it implicit, but we're going to see some of that rhetoric through the primary season.
And Scott, we have about a minute left. I want to ask you about some questions you didn't ask on your poll, and that's about guns and abortion. Will you be polling on those issues later this year, next year, or why not those questions and some other instead?
Yes. We kind of alternate a good bit. We've asked about abortion on the last poll. We will ask about it on future polls. We've asked about gun issues, especially the Charleston loophole. We've asked about that in the past, and we'll ask about it in the future. Space is at a premium, and to get an accurate poll, you've got to get a certain number of people, and especially in a mixed mode poll like this, where some are online and some are called on the phone, it's getting tougher and tougher to get people. The polls have to be shorter, but I can assure you, things like gun control issues and abortion are going to appear on future polls as well.
Gotcha. Well, thank you so much for letting us know what South Carolinians are thinking. That's Scott Huffmon. He's a Winthrop University political science professor, and he's the director of the Winthrop Poll. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you.
To stay up to date with the latest news throughout the week, check out the South Carolina Lead. It's a podcast that I host on Tuesdays and Saturdays that you can find on southcarolinapublicradio.org or wherever you find podcasts. For South Carolina ETV, I'm Gavin Jackson. Be well, South Carolina.